Well, good afternoon, and welcome to Truth and Wholeness. I'm Dr. Albert LaChance, and I will be with you for as long as you stay with me. And we'll be talking about a number of things, but they will all amount to ultimately truth and truth's resultant wholeness. And if you recall last time, if you've seen the early two broadcasts or podcasts, um, you'll note that I have asked you for your trust, and this is a hard time in our history to ask anyone to trust. But I want you to know that that's what I need in order for any of this to reach you in a way that you can at least deliberate and choose to buy into or not. But from my soul, through my heart and brain, I'm telling you the truth as I know it. And I have been at this now for a long time, half a century, trying to put together the wholeness that arises out of truth. And that has brought me to all the traditions of the world, be they Chinese, Indian, Middle Eastern, indigenous, all of them having been taken seriously by me, all melding into a common understanding that really belongs to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and my great teacher Thomas Berry, both of whom have passed and left many of us enchanted with their work. And I've come to believe that this work was meant to be a turning point in Western civilization, which would represent a turning point in the life systems of the planet, in the planet itself, in the biosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and all of it would come from what Teilhard and Thomas Berry call the noosphere, the sphere of knowing. And the sphere of knowing has, in the way that we've evolved culturally, it has several different loci in which wisdom is sought out. It's not about agreeing on whether it's monotheistic or polytheistic or non-theistic. None of that really matters much. What matters is that each of them produce within their various cultures a form of wisdom that leads to the presence of the sacred everywhere. And it was our generation, and I'm speaking now of the baby boomers, who were called not to go out and destroy the world and focus on gathering money and having privilege and all of that, but our real calling in the early 60s was to the planet. Even somebody as personally sick as Jim Morrison of the Doors, and he was suffering terribly with addiction illness, terribly, took his life. But even he, in one of his greatest songs, When the Music's Over, it's the name of the song, he said this: "What have we done to the earth? What have we done to our fair sister? Ravaged and plundered and ripped her and bit her, stuck her with knives in the side of the dawn, tied her with fences and dragged her down. I hear a very gentle sound with your ear down to the ground. We want the world and we want it now." And then he lets out one of these screams that the Who were also famous for, this long now. And it was so powerful. I saw Jim Morrison at a place called the Psychedelic Supermarket during the late 60s. And he wasn't 2 feet from me in this concert hall. I was standing right in front of him, so much so that his sweat from his hair was spraying on me. One of my daughters said, "You should never have taken another shower." Anyway, um, I was so impacted by that that it's in my major prophetic poem called Jonah. I put it in there and quoted it because it was such a powerful statement. And the worst of it all is that the 60s, there were a lot of good points about the 60s, the end of the war in Vietnam, and all the rest of that stuff, the beginning of the equality of the sexes and all of it. And it was all good stuff. But we did not stop the desecration of the planet. And that was the call. And many of us heard that call and heard it clearly. I think of Ken Wilber as another one. Ken Wilber did with Sri Aurobindo what I have done with Teilhard de Chardin. And so together, and we did get together to discuss the synthesis of the two. So I'm here now to represent that kind of thinking. This is kind of like Custer's last, or it's LaChance's last stand, trying to get it all out there, 50 years of scholarship, because I can't write fast enough to get everything down that's in me. But the horrible truth is that we had an answer. There was an answer. And that answer was embodied in the prophetic vision of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, recognized by Thomas Berry and stomped on by the Catholic Church. And there are many biographers of Thomas Berry and Teilhard who have compared Teilhard to what they have called the second Aquinas. So the unfolding of Catholic truth, which we've absolutely dismissed, people who know nothing about it, nothing other than whatever they've seen in a a podcast like this or whatever. They haven't taken the time to stop and plunge deeply into what it actually is. Well, I have, and I met a brother today uh, named Peter who's here with me, and my friend Nick over many years have really tried to hear what this is. So the way it would have worked out, at least, at least, it would have been St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, those would be the first two millennia, and then Teilhard de Chardin, who had a doctrinally sound view of the entire span of Christianity. And they never condemned him, they silenced him. And then um, Pope Paul, in the second half of Vatican II, said this: Teilhard de Chardin is a man for our times. And then we've proceeded to ignore him. So, what I'm trying to do now is catch us up. So, either he was the second Aquinas, the third millennium covenant with the sacred in the Western world, which would have preserved the world and many of the other cultures, because they're trying to be what we are, thinking that somehow a BMW is going to make them happy. It's the Western world that has to be addressed, and that's what I'm asking you to trust me with, because I'm going to say some wild stuff. And I'm going to begin with making you aware of a website that I stumbled on, really, because my wife was looking at it, I guess. I don't remember. But it was recently, within a couple of weeks, and it's called BURT, B-U-R-T, wolf, as in the animal, wolf.com. And what is present there is the most current analyses and diagnoses of what the digital world is doing to our brains and our bodies, because the entire digital world is grounded in electromagnetic fields, and those fields are right here, right here, right here. We move in the fluid, in a sense, the electric fluid of these fields. And we too are comprised of a holarchy of electromagnetic fields. And it's altering us genetically. It's changing the neurology of the brain. It's producing the diagnoses du jour of attention deficit disorder and all the rest of them that people like myself trained to diagnose them think of them as an individual anomaly in the brain of the person who's sitting in front of us and paying for our understanding. And the problem is collective, it's not individual. Each of us is suffering, and all humans suffer anyway. I mean, in the East, we have Gautama Buddha saying all life entails suffering. In the West, we have the crucifixion, that's the way to awakening, to enlightenment. People suffer. We all suffer. But this kind of suffering has been misunderstood because it has altered the way in which the neural pathways of the brain are able to process information. And you can tell it, you can even sense it in the speed of people's way of talking. You take a guy like me who knows very little about technology and has even less interest in it that I could describe. I'm appealing to you through it, but I don't know much about it and I don't care to know much about it. So we speak at a certain rate. And if we have the courage to go ask somebody at Best Buy or wherever else it might be, what we get is, and so if you go, you press the, and then you go over there, and so I'm like, and so she's like, and there's machine gun kind of use of words until you finally scratch your head and say, I think I'll go without. Bye. And walk out of the store. Because if I didn't have people here who are helping me do this work, Kelly and Robin, my two colleagues here in this, it wouldn't be getting done. And I'd just be sitting home despairing about the fact that I can't write enough to get this out, all of it. So I'm asking people to go to that website, and it's not fun. It's not fun. It's very scary. It's very scary, but we've got to come to a clear understanding of what it is. And then I've already talked about the overall destruction of the life systems of the planet. So I mentioned last time, for those of you who hear the first and second, I mentioned that not the churches, from Catholic on down, but the UN has stepped in and tried to be the adult in the room and has said, most of you know this by now, but you won't know the third one because it just came out. The first thing they said was, we have 12 years or less before the creativity of the planet becomes catastrophic rather than creative. Then they came out, I don't know, a month or two ago, 1 million species are imminently disappearing. 1 million species. I remember I remember my blood running cold when Thomas Berry would tell me, once you eliminate a species, not even God can bring it back because it's not part of the code anymore. Well, the third one has just come out, and I hope I'm quoting this correctly. I always feel like I'm exaggerating. Always. I always have this thing, is this you, Albert, that exaggerating? I heard another statement come out of the UN that said 60% of the food that is present in the ocean in the form of fish and so forth will be missing, will be gone by the end of the century. So the population keeps growing and the food base and energy base keeps shrinking, and that's how we get to catastrophic change between the creativity of the earth and its demise. And we have liars in high office, and liars they are because a lot of these people are really bright. A lot of them are very educated, and they know that the liar in chief is lying constantly. The last count on CNN last week was 10,900 and something. I think it was 985 lies in 2.5 years documented. I wrote in that same prophetic poem called Jonah that the earth can't sustain a culture gone mad. So we're going mad in a number of different ways. And the more we're embedded and marinating in lies, the worse it's all going to be because we're a being capable of truth and wholeness. And wholeness, by the way, is the same word in the Greek as holiness. It's the same word, holos. And amazingly, kataholos is the real, putting them together, those two words, comes out katholos. The Catholic Church, and God bless Pope Francis, because he's an old man and he's really trying. And I know what it's like to be growing old and lose that energy you once had. But what a mess. And it's because we once again stomped on the prophet. We have got to take the evolution of the earth and the evolution of the culture, which is called the noosphere. It's the collection, the collective um, body of human wisdom. And you can think of each of the traditions as a kind of value volcano. The values keep coming up through Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucius, indigenous cultures, all of them. And what have we done with it? We've spent decades, centuries arguing about the difference in the way in which they arrive at wisdom, truth, and wholeness. It's got to be taken away from the theologians. It's got to be given to the mystics. So, what Teilhard actually did was to create a roadmap through the invisible. And the universe is almost entirely invisible. Even the distance between the atoms that comprise the molecules that comprise the tissue of this aging primate that you see in front of you here, all of them have more space than anything else. I've heard it compared to that the parts of the atom, the electron, proton, and neutron, if you place the electron um, or the nucleus of the atom is a better way to put it, on the pitcher's mound at Fenway, the electrons are in the outfield. We're almost entirely empty. That's the word sunyata. That is what the word sunyata in Sanskrit means. And in Greek, the same thing is the word kenosis. It means emptying. And there's a methodology for emptying and a template for the future too. And we're going to be talking about that. So the deeper guilt of Catholicism is about is made understandable through this statement in the beginning of one of my books it was an edited book, myself and John Carroll, and it's called Catholic Approaches to Ecology. And this is what Thomas Berry had to say in 1982 while there was still time. The future of the Catholic Church in America in my view, will depend upon, above all, on its capacity to assume a religious responsibility for the fate of the earth. For ecclesiastical authorities to be so negligent, indifferent, or unaware of the imperiled status of the planet in all its living and non-living components can be considered a monumental failure. It's a civilizational failure. Everybody, we run to church. I believe in God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, fruit of the earth and the work of human hands, you Catholics out there, among whom is me. Fruit of the earth and the work of human hands. Let it be done on earth as it is in heaven. This is a divine creation. We're supposed to be representing that. We're supposed to be ambassadors of that, not plunderers of that for the next trinket. So in order of magnitude, this goes far beyond any other failure for which the church may be responsible. And that includes all of the horrors, the Inquisition in the 16th century, my own, the collapse of the Catholic Church in 2002 because of the destruction of children. I was one of those kids. And I still believe that if you take the time to study what Catholicism is and not run on prejudice, but instead run on understanding, you'll find the very resource that we're neglecting. So then he goes on, the devastation that is presently taking place throughout the industrial technological exploitation of the earth is already so great that future generations are presently condemned not only to live amid the ruins of the infrastructures of industrial society, but also amid the ruins of the natural world itself. So far, church authorities, religious orders, and Catholic universities and seminaries, priests and people have shown an amazing insensitivity to this most urgent of all issues confronting the human community. My question is, after we burn our lifeboat, how will we stay afloat? What will then be the need of religion, Christianity, or the church? And it goes on for a couple of more paragraphs, but you get the drift, I hope. So what he's saying is something, if you know, I sat with him for 6 years face to face and talked to him and listened. Actually, I listened to him. It's where I learned to listen. And if he were talking, for instance, about Martin Luther King, the the black church with their prophet were not afraid to talk about what was going on in church. They weren't afraid of it. And they supported their people all the way up to and including a black president of the greatest dignity, purpose, and goodness, and his dignified wife and his beautiful daughters for 8 years. Why are we not told? Well, we got nice prayers. I mean, I practice as an Episcopalian now because of the trauma involved with me going into Catholic churches at this point. But I'm Catholic. I call myself an Episcopalian Catholic. Why can't we talk about it? Why is it that I could give manuscripts like of my book to the Diocese of Manchester, New Hampshire, Bishop Gendron, only to demand it back 6 or 8 months later, unopened? And the book was called Cultural Addiction. That's what it's called now. It was called Green Spirit back then. It's the same book, Cultural Addiction. What are we facing as one of the unbelievable parts of this breakdown? that we're experiencing individually and collectively? Cultural addiction. So, what I'm hoping is the roadmap that Teilhard laid out for us, which would have recreated our vision of the natural world, resacralized it. My hope is that roadmap will be at least understood in some fashion. My greatest fear, my greatest terror, my greatest nausea is that it's too late. I don't know. No one can say that. Things are still growing and, but all the reports from the scientific community, contrary to the liars that are standing when they know they're lying, in order to protect their whatever the benefit is in representing us with lies. They know. And the weakling priests and the weakling clergy all the way around the block from Catholicism all the way to fundamentalism are not really talking about this. And yet, the planet, the culture is fraying. We see it very clear. The planet is fraying. We can see it. It's very clear. And yet we go on with our pieties. We go on with our prayers, missing out on the real possibility that Teilhard de Chardin, who died of all days on Easter Sunday, 1955, and left in his notebook the night before, among other statements of where he thought he was going to continue to live, obviously, like we all do, but it was over for him in the morning. He wrote Neo-Catholicism, question mark. There was about 10 years when I was selling what I called a new Catholic mysticism. I taught it in Boston more than anywhere else, and it kept on running. So there are good things happening, but there are two things that have to be understood if this podcast is to make any sense at all and exhibit truth and wholeness. We've got to tell the truth. However inconvenient, however frustrating it is, if we don't start owning up to what we have to do, we will continue to fragment, because wholeness only comes from truth. And right now, the greatest center of truth is in the 12-step programs, where people surrender their own will and their own neurology to the care of God as they understand God in any tradition. So I'm going to make two more points, and then I'm going to end this today with a good story that happened between me and Bishop McCormick. You might recall that Bishop McCormick was Cardinal Law's right-hand man in Boston during the cover-up and the horror of what happened to so many people like myself as a boy. I was just another boy. I was just a kid. And it all happened, everything you've read about. So, but before I give you that story and end on a positive note, I want to make it very clear. Teilhard de Chardin was the incarnation of truth in the Western world. He's been called the second Aquinas. He's been hinted on as the second coming, not that he was Jesus of Nazareth, in a French Jesuit robe. That's not it. It's that he embodied the wisdom of the Logos, which is one of the ways to think about Christ. He embodied it. So what was the second coming supposed to be? Was he supposed to have sandals on and be, dragging a cross down the street? No, that would certainly not be the right guy. It's the wisdom that St. John understood when he wrote his gospel. And this guy, by the way, uh, St. John's gospel was Pierre de Chardin's favorite gospel. He loved it. He also liked St. Paul, which gave me cause to pause. I have to relook at St. Paul. I've had some difficulties with him. But anyway, he was the incarnation of truth that would have spread down through the Western um, civilizational structures. And he was silenced. And then thought of as sort of a heretic when they didn't even condemn him. And Pope Paul said very clearly, he's a man for a time. He was still treated by the pipsqueaks, the spiritual pipsqueaks. He was treated like a foreigner. He was the incarnation of truth, and it's in about 20 volumes, 25 volumes, and I'm going to try to exegete all of those one more time. I've read most of them 2 or 3 times already, and few that I haven't. And that's going to be my final life work, is to try to put that out there. And if he was the incarnation of truth, because truth is unitive, truth brings people together in safety. Truth brings people together where they feel each other's souls. They're not arguing about the claptrap in the brain, which is getting more and more difficult anyway. But truth and wholeness leads to love. And I'm not talking about sexual love only. I'm talking about love. The presence of the sacred. And if that's true, and I believe it is, then President Trump is the incarnation of the contradiction of truth. And that does me no good to say I take no pleasure in it. I take no pleasure in it. But I have had presidents in my life, such as Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, that should have been president, and above all, Barack Obama, but also Jimmy Carter, who has been maligned and ridiculed because he was too damn good for the job. And he was soon replaced. And so was Barack, soon replaced with its opposite. Now, the Chinese would say, well, yes, that's yin and yang, and maybe that's what has to happen. I don't know. But I do know that when the truth appears, we really should cherish it, serve it with what T.S. Eliot called a lifetime's death in love. Ardor, selflessness, and self-surrender. That's from T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. A lifetime's death in love. Ardor, selflessness, and self-surrender. And as we watch the Republican Party become a crime family, we have to ask ourselves, where will the courage come to value the truth, to value each other, whether we're brown or black or red or white? Where will the value come from? It will come from our traditions, or it won't come at all. And Teilhard said that in 1934. He talked about the fact, he made this incredible statement. He said, sooner or later, mankind is going to find himself caught between the choice of suicide or worship. That's going to be the choice. So now let me end with this little story about Bishop McCormick. And so those of you who went through that period of time, 2002, and the breakdown that came from, and more importantly, those of you who have lived through that time and lived through the abuse, this story is a sign of hope. When the church melted down in 2002, I was already kind of a prominent Catholic around Manchester, and New Hampshire is a small state. We can have every presidential candidate in our living room. We only need to say yes to it. But anyway, the bishop at the time when it was all breaking down and falling apart had become John McCormick. He was taken from Boston, and Cardinal Law was given this nice cushy little job off in Rome at this beautiful little church, and is spending his days that way. So McCormick comes after me, the lost sheep, right? Must have heard that I was in the Episcopal Church or something. I certainly didn't leave Christ. So he comes after me, and the night before I prostrated myself. Those two words are weird. Um, on my belly in front of a tabernacle, and I said, "If you give me a sign, I will go right back to the church, but it's got to be clear. You got to make it clear for me tomorrow." So he calls me anyway. They make the appointment for me to meet him at St. Anselm's College. He wanted me to go to Ash Street, which is diocesan headquarters. I've never stepped into that building without coming out demeaned. Then the suggestion was he could come to my offices. I owned a counseling agency at that time. And I said, no, I don't want it to be on my turf either. I want it to be neutral. We both know Abbot Matthew. Bring us there. So we go there, and he asks me to tell him his story. And I start telling my story. And I look up, and he's asleep. And I said, are you sleeping? He comes out of it. And the next thing I know, I go back to it. And at this point, I'm crying. I'm really hurting. My childhood was taken away by these people. And I look up, and he's asleep again. And so he wakes up, and it dawns on me in Gethsemane, or just before, they fell asleep. First of all was the refusal to admit on Peter's part, and then they fall asleep 3 times until he finally says, "Sleep on, sleep on," and he wasn't talking about a night's sleep, metaphorically. Believe me, sleep on. So I walk away from that and enter into counseling to try to deal with the damage that did me. I had to close my office for a month and get treatment for the pain that was in me from that kind of rejection. Time goes by, and Francis arrives, is elected to the papacy. And I'm reading in a newspaper somewhere or someplace, I don't know, I read all the time, several hours a day. And he said something, he told a story. He said, this priest wrote to him and said, "Holy Father, can you forgive me for my um, crimes against children?" So the Pope, Francis, he says, "Well, yes, of course I can forgive you. But if you want forgiveness that you can feel and know as forgiveness, you've got to go to your victims and ask for their forgiveness." Nobody had ever asked me, and they knew It was so egregious what they did to me that they never even um, questioned me about it. They just wrote the checks. So time goes by, and I read this thing by Pope Francis, and I get this idea in my mind for my sake as well as for John McCormick's sake, to call him up and say, listen, no, I wrote him a letter. And I said, listen, I heard the Pope say blah, blah, blah. And you know who I am, and you know that I've been a victim. And I just want you to know that we're both old men now. And if you want forgiveness, I'm willing to give you that at this point. It will heal both of us. In other words, truth and wholeness. 2 days, maybe on the third day, I get a call from him. I'm making my breakfast, and he says, "Hi, this is John McCormick. I got your letter, and yes, I would love to have your forgiveness. And I don't know, what your schedule is like." And I said, "Well, when would you like to meet?" And he said, "How about Friday?" This was Wednesday. And he was an eager beaver at that point. And so I said, okay, call Abbot Matthew again, and I will get together up there again, and we'll do a replay on this. Well, it turns out that when he was falling asleep, he was on his way to quadruple bypass surgery, which I too had in 2008. My daughters kept asking my wife, sit dad down anywhere, and he goes to sleep. I had three arteries blocked at 90% and one at 100, and I was falling asleep everywhere. And all of a sudden, I understood why he was falling asleep. There was truth and there was wholeness. And then he starts talking about surgery to his back on L5S1. And guess who also had surgery on his back in that interim? L5S1. So suddenly I was sitting with a guy who, however deluded he was, however absent-minded, however lazy in the soul he had been, was just another bozo on the bus. So what happened from there is he asked me to pray my forgiveness over him. Now there's a reversal, isn't it? Isn't that amazing? That I'm sitting there with a bishop, and I prayed forgiveness over him. And he then said to me, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "Well, you can give me an apostolic blessing. You are, in fact, an apostle. And I would like your blessing for my life and my pain and my ongoing service to the world as a prophet within the Catholic community." And he did that, and I felt it. So then he says, "Is there anything else I can do for you? Anything?" And I said, "Yes, I have this book called The Third Covenant, and it talks about Teilhard de Chardin, Thomas Berry, and me, and what could be a new covenant in the Catholic Church that is totally doctrinal, it's sound, and it's wed to the tradition as it is." And I said, "I want you to get this to the Pope, to Pope Francis, because this is one of Francis's brothers. Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit. It's an order of priests and brothers, and the Pope also is a Jesuit." And I said, "I know I'll get some fluffy thing back if I send it. Oh, the Pope thanks you, blah, blah." So I said, "You send it and ask the Pope to read this." I still haven't heard from the Pope, but I got a beautiful letter from John recently that reached my heart, and I see a friendship there that could really do some good in the world, to say, okay, I'm the victim and I am the perpetrator. So forgiveness is a reality. There was an answer. I don't know if there still is, and it's called the work of Teilhard de Chardin, Thomas Berry, and myself. It's called the Third Covenant. There are reasons for hope, but sadly, there is greater reason for despair right now. And I leave you with that. That was Truth and Wholeness for this podcast. And I will present another one shortly uh, in the hope that we can salvage truth and wholeness in Western culture and bring that to the world instead of weapons, pollution, greed, materialism, and everything else we market day in and day out. God bless you.